Hey everyone. This evening, we're stepping into the boots of the Lewis and Clark expedition, thick with mud, stiff with frost, and far heavier than you'd like. This wasn't a sightseeing tour. It was a 2-year march into the unknown, where hunger gnawed harder than the cold, blisters turned to infection, and the next meal might just look back at you before you ate it. For the average modern human, accustomed to climate control, grocery stores, and GPS, this journey would break you slowly, then all at once. Out here, survival meant grit, luck, and the willingness to keep walking when everything hurt. Take a second to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one. Now, settle in. Close your eyes, unwind, and let the echoes of the past drift into the quiet corners of your mind. Could you survive a continent-spanning journey with no modern maps, no GPS, and the constant possibility of never making it home? The Lewis and Clark expedition wasn't just an adventure. It was a slow, grinding struggle against a land that did not care if you lived or died. Imagine going months without fresh food, drinking water you couldn't trust, feeling winter winds sharp enough to cut through fur. Many of us today would struggle to last even a week. We'll treat each mile as a test, the land as the antagonist, and watch how these daily trials piled into life or death choices. First, imagine the very first week. You open your eyes to a pale, cold light. The air is wet enough to cling to your skin. Your back is stiff from a night spent on frozen ground, each stone and root pressed into you as if they'd been placed there on purpose. Your legs are heavy, reluctant to move. The day ahead is waiting, though it has already taken more than you feel you have to give. The men in the expedition rose without complaint because there was no room for it. The river would not wait. The ground, indifferent, would not grow softer. The pace had to hold steady for hours, day after day, no matter how you felt. Even at the very start, when morale was high, the burden was immense. There was the weight you could see: packs, rifles, provisions strapped and bundled in ways that fought against every step, and the weight no one could measure: expectation. Keeping up wasn't optional. This was not a stroll along smooth roads. Each mile was an uneven struggle through sucking mud, up steep banks, across loose stone that shifted underfoot, or into thickets that scraped and tore at your legs. You weren't wearing shoes built to breathe and cushion. You had stiff, unyielding leather that softened only to let the water in. The first steps into marshy ground soaked them through, and the seams gnawed at your ankles until the skin split. That could happen within hours. Straps from your gear cut into your shoulders, rubbing grit into the raw skin beneath. The pain never fully eased at camp. It sat deep in the flesh, ready to flare again the instant you lifted your load. Modern life rarely prepares the body for this kind of work. We train our muscles to sit, to drive, to stand briefly, to walk flat city blocks. We eat on time, breathe easily, sleep with control over light and warmth. Out here, every morning added a fresh layer of soreness to the last. There was no recovery. The choice was to rise and move, or risk becoming the one everyone else had to wait for, a role no one could afford to play. When they weren't pushing forward on foot, they were pushing against the river itself. Boats couldn't be left to drift. Even in these opening days, stretches of unmoving water demanded hours of poling, towing, or steady rowing. On days that spared them the hardest rowing, There was bankside hauling, hands gripping wet ropes, bodies leaning forward until every muscle burned. This work didn't just erode strength, it pressed down on the mind. Every man knew that slowing meant threatening the mission as a whole. There was no reprieve in small comforts. At day's end, there was no hot meal laid out, no steady walls to shut out cold and dark. Night brought unfamiliar sounds. Canvas rattling in the wind, wooden frames creaking, water lapping in the black distance. For someone used to light at the flick of a switch, heat that starts with a button, and walls to banish the strange, that absence unsettles quickly. Even the smallest reluctance had no place here. Dawn offered no bargains. By week's end, you would be hollowed by the effort. The fire in your legs dulls into a constant throb. Your feet move past, blistering into aches deep inside the muscle. Hands used for rowing, pulling, or holding a rifle start to swell and form hardened pads beneath the skin. Pads that threaten to split with the next shift of grip. Hunger hovers in the background always. Early on, meals bite into the stores too fast, and so rations tighten. You chew rough bread or dried meat without enough to ever feel full, your body already asking for more fuel than you can spare. Hunger narrows your focus. You try to match the rhythm of those beside you, because slipping out of step risks a fall. A toe catches a hidden root, a boot slides on bank mud, and you're down. Every fall risks injury. Here, even a mild injury could drag the group back. That awareness keeps you cautious, planting each foot with care. But it also wears you down more than you expect. The effort is in your legs, your lungs, and your mind. Even for someone strong by modern standards, the shift to this life would feel brutal. These men had been shaped from youth by physical work, plowing, hunting, carrying heavy loads, and still their journals often note early sickness, strains, swelling joints. This was not endurance for training's sake. It was the endurance required simply to keep moving. And still, each night, the ache stayed with you. You slept in clothes stiff with dried sweat, the cold seeping in as soon as you lay still. Warmth came only from what you wrapped around yourself. Water was drawn from whatever source you reached, clean if you trusted it to be. Overhead, the fabric of a tent or the open branches of a tree were all that separated you from the night air. The next day would start as soon as the light touched camp. This wasn't a test you passed through bursts of effort followed by rest. There was no rest, only a repeated demand, sunrise after sunrise. Even the strongest were being stretched thin by the end of that first week. The pace did not slow for fatigue. Rest came in moments stolen at the edges of the day, never enough to truly restore you. For most of us now, the first week would be when cracks started to appear, quietly but surely. And that was only the beginning. Soon, the river would test them in a very different way. A river is supposed to take you where you want to go, maybe slowly, maybe with some force, but more or less in the direction you're pointing the bow. The Missouri in 1804 was nothing like that. It was a restless, shifting force that pushed back at each attempt to move against it. Imagine stepping into a boat and finding that every foot you worked to gain was stolen almost at once. The current didn't carry. It resisted, and it resisted without pause. You could feel it in the weight of the oar, in the rope dragging at your hands, in the pole driven deep into the mud and straining back against you. always pulling on muscles already worn from the days spent on land. For the men, the Missouri often felt like their first true enemy. Unlike a hill, there was no crest to reach. Unlike a storm, there was no passing through until clear skies returned. The river stayed with them, day after day, rising and falling with the season, changing its shape without warning. They could wake to find new sandbars blocking yesterday's route, or watch a once reliable channel vanish overnight into knee-deep water. Stretches that seemed safe could hide dangers underneath. Snags, branches, or entire tree trunks spun and held below the surface until the current sent them lunging at whatever passed overhead. Going upriver meant three main kinds of work: rowing, driving long poles against the bottom to lever the boat along, and towing from the bank with heavy ropes. Some days they did all three. The keelboat was large and laden with many tons of cargo, and even moving it a short distance demanded effort from everyone aboard. Hands blistered, split, and then hardened only to crack and tear again. Backs cramped from the strain, legs burned from trudging through the bank's deep mud while hauling. There was no steady rhythm here. The river took it away with every bend, every shoal, every hidden branch catching the hull. The Missouri surrounded them with water, but seldom offered any they could drink without careful work. Its flow ran thick with silt, its shallows churned by animals. Whenever they could, they strained or boiled it, but that took time and fuel, both hard to spare. Summer heat drew sweat faster than they could replace it, and when they knelt at the bank to fill kettles, mosquitoes swarmed their hands and faces, leaving raw welts that itched beneath the next day's sweat and grit. Some days, the strain simply dropped men where they stood. They'd collapse in the grass near the bank, too spent to be ordered on straight away. Sometimes they rose after a few minutes. Other times it took much longer to push them back into the line of rope haulers or rowers. Even those raised to farm work or heavy labor had rarely fought a moving force like this, day after day, with no fixed end to the task. The water seemed to mock the effort, lapping gently at the hull while holding them still, as if to remind them how much stronger it was. The real danger lay not only in slow exhaustion, but in sudden disaster. Where the current narrowed between bends, rafts of debris gathered, dead branches, splintered trunks, whole uprooted trees revolving together. If a boat drifted into that churn, the river could flip it in seconds. A man caught underneath might be slammed into a submerged snag, the impact breaking wood or bone without slowing the flow. Ropes could wrap around legs in the scramble to get clear. An oar caught by the current could tear free, leaving the crew without a tool to fend off the next blow from the drifting wood. This was not a river you could swim free from if things went wrong. The pull was too strong. Step wrong loading cargo or lose your footing while poling at the bow, and the river might claim you in minutes. Everyone knew that losing a boat meant losing food, tools, trade goods, records, almost everything needed to keep going. The Missouri's hazards threatened body and mission alike. And yet, they tried to learn it. They watched the color of the water for signs of depth, listened to its sound hitting the hull, scanned for thin lines of foam that might betray a hidden obstacle. But this was not a companion you could grow to know fully. The river remade itself after a hard rain far upstream, or even under cover of an ordinary night's fog. A clear route in the morning might turn into a dead end by the time they returned. Nights often ended with the boats pulled close to shore, struck firmly to thick trees to keep them from drifting off while men slept. The sound of the current under them became part of each night, still moving, still pressing on in the dark. The river never considered their pace, their losses, or their need for rest. To them, the Missouri was neither good nor evil, just vast, cold, and unwilling to yield. It took their energy without care, because that was what it had done to every living thing that fought to move against it. It needed no raging rapids or dramatic waterfalls to be dangerous. One slip was enough to erase weeks of careful progress. The river took no pity, and one mistake could erase months of work. And once the water was finally behind them, the challenges ahead would demand a different kind of strength, the kind needed when you cannot even be sure you're heading the right way. Finding your way across open country was its own trial. They had no reliable map. Only the loosest outlines passed from hand to hand, rumors stitched into memory and patched with uncertain sketches. Some features might exist, others not at all. Each horizon could be telling the truth or lying quietly about what lay beyond. For the core of discovery, the land turned into a question each time they stepped away from the riverbank. Was the next bend the start of open plains or the foot of an impassable ridge? Would a line of low hills offer a pass, or would they be forced to turn back? A wrong choice drained not only time, but food, water, and the will to keep pressing forward. Their navigation was pieced together from what others would share, often Native American guides whose deep knowledge came from generations tied to the same rivers, valleys, and game trails. But a guide's certainty could only stretch as far as their own traveled world. Beyond that edge lay guesswork again, and even the clearest directions could fade quickly into uncertainty. When weather and time allowed, they used instruments and celestial sights to fix their position, charting the stars against the open sky. It was a careful, slow process, and one rainstorm, one heavy bank of cloud, could take it away entirely. Even a small error could go unnoticed until the land itself revealed their mistake. More often, they relied on trial and error. Sometimes, they would climb for hours to reach a crest, only to find sheer cliffs on the far side. That lost time and energy could mean the difference between reaching the next water source and running dry. Each wrong path was not just disappointment. It was another meal eaten from stores that might not be replaced. It's easy to forget how narrow the margin was. Today, we are rarely without clear directions, and obstacles come with alternate routes already planned. For these men, a dead end meant stopping until they could cut or walk their way forward. There was no rescue from the frustration, no quick redirection. The popular image of explorers shows them striding forward with confidence, but in truth, for many miles they likely moved slowly, uncertain. Their mental maps just scattered islands of known places linked by hard-won guesswork. The ground ahead was never a romantic void. It was an ongoing risk that could grind away both body and mind. When they did find the place they'd been told to expect, a certain bend in a river, a peak that matched the description, it brought real relief. These moments were rare, and they mattered. Each confirmed landmark became a fixed point on their growing chart, shrinking the unknown just a little. Those small gains also confirmed that their efforts were not in vain. But between such points stretched long days of choosing blindly, moving through low grasslands that seemed identical in every direction. A cloud shadow could be mistaken for a hill, and distances could fool the eye until hard ground proved the truth. Sometimes it was only by reaching the spot that they learned if it could be crossed at all. Even on water, certainty slipped away. A river might divide suddenly, each branch looking plausible until one dead-ended in debris or shoals. Choosing wrong meant turning back through the same tiring current they had just fought to overcome. The cost showed in work-worn hands, blistered anew at each effort. The mental toll of this guesswork was constant. It is one thing to work your muscles to exhaustion. It is another to remake a plan every morning from scraps of knowledge, knowing that each guess takes something from your body that you may not get back. Unlike rowing or hauling, there was no rhythm to settle into, only repeated decisions carrying the weight of failure. Modern travel doesn't expose most of us to this. We don't stand at a fork wondering if one path will take away 2 days of food. We don't measure each choice against the chance of finding ourselves stranded without help. For the core, every decision was made with the understanding that a mistake could not just slow them, it could remove the chance of reaching their goal entirely. So they kept moving, sketching additions to their maps when they could. A curve in the bank, the bend of a creek. Each small note was a safeguard for the future. The white spaces on their charts shrank slowly, but every mark counted. Confirmation was precious because it anchored them in a shifting and uncertain world. Even so, direction was never separate from effort. They navigated while carrying loads, while wading through mud, while steering boats past obstacles. Guessing the right way was inseparable from meeting whatever the land put in front of them at that moment. Some days, the land cooperated. Other days, it pushed back in ways no guide or map could warn them of. So how did they make those choices when guessing could cost a life? Sometimes the answer came from instinct, sometimes from the Earth's markers, and sometimes from deferring to those whose knowledge of the ground ran deeper. But there were limits to every method, and when the season shifted and the air itself turned harsh, finding the way forward became only part of the struggle. Cold could freeze meat quickly, locking in the day's hunt before you had time to prepare it. The same chill scraped across a man's face until the skin felt tight, raw, and cracked. And there were no lined boots, insulated jackets, or synthetic gloves to keep warmth where it belonged. Winter was not just a colder season. It behaved like a force that moved through camp, creeping in the dark hours before dawn, settling into any gap in cloth or weakness in the body. Only the narrow circle of heat from a fire offered any defense, and even that could fail. Shelter gave some relief, but only at the edges. Log walls with mud packed into the cracks, a roof heavy enough to bear snow. These were built quickly, their job to break the worst of the wind. The cold still threaded through every seam. At night, you stayed in your clothes, each layer still damp with sweat or melting frost from the day. By morning, the fabric had stiffened, clinging like thin boards around your body. That damp chill stripped heat faster than you could make it, pulling warmth away while you slept. Even breathing was a reminder of how complete the cold's hold was. Inhaled air stung the nose and throat. Breath came out as a visible cloud, freezing into crystals on your scarf or beard until it felt as if you were wearing a mask of ice. By morning, that cloth could be set aside like thin metal, rigid and brittle against your hands. Hands and feet always faltered first. Without real insulation, fingers went stiff enough to fumble flint and steel. Small tasks became clumsy battles. Tying rope, striking sparks, cutting meat. Men tucked their hands into their armpits or pressed them hard against their bellies, waiting for the ache of blood returning. Toes shifted from tingling to numb, the skin taking on a pale, waxy look. When feeling returned, it brought pain sharp enough to make a man call out, though no one had the strength to laugh at it. Fire was the center of every winter day. Without it, there was no survival. But fuel was never infinite. On the plains, dead wood could be scarce. In thick forests, snow might bury it out of reach. Morning meant taking up the axe before the light was fully grown, knocking frozen branches loose, or cutting heavy boughs down. The work itself burned what little warmth you managed to keep through the night. Green wood smoked high, working its way into breath, clothing, and hair until everything smelled of it. Dry wood vanished in a fraction of the time it took to gather it. Each armful burned meant one fewer waiting for you tomorrow. Modern fabrics and heaters let us keep winter outside, controlled and at a distance. The core had nothing that could push the cold entirely away. It found its way through every barrier, through wool, through leather, even through the logs of a cabin. No one stripped down for sleep. You stayed fully clothed, boots and all, and hoped the layers could hold back enough of the night chill to reach morning. Winter also cut into food. Hunting grew thin when animals moved off or holed up. Fish might still be there, but only behind ice that had to be broken before a line could touch the water. Movement cost energy, but stillness was worse. The cold burned through calories faster than walking ever could. Men grew leaner under their coats. Every bite mattered more as fat disappeared and muscle wasted. And the smaller the meals became, the heavier every gust of wind felt against bone. There were routines that kept men alive, feeding the fire before it dimmed, sharing heat when nights grew brutal, forcing the body to move even when every joint urged it to stay still. Firewatch was essential. Through the hours, pairs or trios of men took turns keeping the flames alive. Drift off for too long, and the cold would take its place. Those minutes tending the fire in darkness carried the weight of every man sleeping nearby. Illness pressed in hardest in winter's tight quarters. A cough could darken into something worse when the body's heat and strength were already spoken for. Inside cramped shelters, sickness spread easily. Infection from a small wound took longer to heal, blood going first to protect the core, leaving less to fight anything else. Each man who woke feeling worse added to the quiet awareness that the cold was no longer the only thing pressing against them. For men already worn by months on their feet, winter didn't stop the work. It stripped away the distance it could cover. Surviving to the next sunrise became a more reliable measure of progress than miles. Short days gave way to long nights, each filled with the shifting groans of frozen trees and the sharp crack pop of sap bursting in the fire. The sound of someone rolling under thick blankets was as much a reminder as the wind outside. The cold was still there, waiting. They endured because there was no other choice. Not easily, and not without cost, but by keeping to the basic tasks that could hold the line. Keep the fire alive. Keep moving enough to matter. share what heat there was. It was a thin defense, but it was all that separated them from the still silence beyond the walls. The thaw came slowly. Snow loosened, ice broke on the rivers, and nights lost their fiercest edge. But the change in season didn't close the door on danger. It opened another. When the thaw came, another danger would follow. Illness that could take those spared by the cold. Out here, even the smallest scrape was a question you couldn't ignore. A torn knuckle from slipping with a tool. A thorn prick working under the skin. A split in the fingertip from handling frozen rope. Each was an opening, and in a place with no surgeon within reach for hundreds of miles. That opening could carry danger far beyond the pain of the moment. The men lived in constant contact with soil, river water that slid past animals and debris, and the raw hides of freshly killed game. Hands stayed dirty within minutes of washing, and the idea of keeping them clean in the modern sense was impossible. Soap as we know it was rare in their packs. Antiseptics didn't exist for them. If a wound got rinsed at all, the river might be its only source, and the water could carry its own invisible hazards. The very notion of germs was not yet understood. Illness or infection was explained through bad air, bad fortune, or imbalance in the body's humors. Without antibiotics, the body's only defense was its own immune system. Once swelling set in, there was little to slow its progress. Small injuries could turn hot and red within days. The skin around them stretched shiny and tight, pain burrowing deep into muscle and bone. What began as a blister from a boot seam might swell into a hard knot that throbbed with every step. A slice from a blade could seem shallow, only to spread infection steadily up the limb. When infection reached the point where a man's life was at risk, there were few choices. Sometimes that meant cutting away the damaged flesh before it claimed more. Field amputations happened with whatever tools were at hand, and there was no anesthesia beyond a mouthful of strong drink or the force of others holding him still. These were quick, brutal measures whose survival rate was uncertain at best, and the days afterward often carried as much risk as the cut itself. Their journals note men lost to injuries that, under other conditions, would have been minor. A swelling gone too far, a fever that would not break, a wound that refused to close. Each could push someone past the point of recovery weeks after the injury was made. Such deaths were not met with shock among their comrades. They were another hardship, counted quietly alongside the miles and the weather. Not all wounds came from their own blades. Tools splintered, shafts cracked, and sharp fragments bit deep into hands and arms. They walked across ground littered with fallen branches and hidden thorns, any of which could pierce skin in a step. Hauling boats or packs invited slips and falls that drove wood or stone into flesh. Even hunting had its share of risks. The kick of a startled deer's hooves, the horn of a buffalo brought down too close, the bite of a smaller animal defending itself. Insects and small animals left their marks as well. Flea or tick bites could swell into ulcers, and constant scratching pressed grit and filth into them. A wound on a finger or palm could make even the simplest work, tying rope, gripping a pole, suddenly impossible. But the work never paused for long enough to rest a limb. More weight shifted to other muscles meant greater risk in the next task, a ripple effect of strain and distraction. Illness often traveled with injury. Bad food or water could lay a man low, with fever and weakness, pulling the body's attention away from even a small cut. A wound left untended in that state worsened quickly. The combination of sickness and injury could push someone into a state from which there was little return. These risks were constant and shaped daily habits. They checked their skin for new marks, tested swollen areas with cautious fingers. They wrapped cloth around wounds at night, hoping to keep out dirt or stinging cold. Some lanced swellings with heated blades, or packed wounds in hopes of drawing the sickness out. Without certainty about what would help, they leaned on what experience and tradition could offer, sometimes just to feel that something had been done. Falling into the river brought its own hazards beyond the shock of cold water. Wet clothes kept the skin soft and made it easier for infection to take hold. A gash opened while working in that state could go hours before it was cleaned or bound, and by then the damage might already be at work under the skin. A slip hauling a rope over slick banks or lifting a load into a boat could open flesh in seconds, and the day's work rarely stopped because of it. They tried to prevent trouble where they could. That meant keeping tools sharp so they didn't slip, repairing gear before it failed, and moving with care over rough ground. A sliced hide, a butchered animal, or a shaped plank all required blades and force, and each use carried the chance of an accident. There was no way to remove the risk entirely, only to reduce the number of times it might catch them. By night, they added injuries to the quiet tally of the day, hoping sleep might bring improvement. The best result was waking to cooled skin and reduced swelling. The worst was finding the heat had spread overnight. Once it moved far enough, the choice narrowed quickly. Try to cut the sickness away, or wait for it to take the rest. Every scrape or splinter in this world carried weight. It was not the mark itself, but what it might begin. That chain, once set in motion, could travel a long way and end far from where it started. It made every task, every reach into brush or grip on a rope, carry a truth they lived with each day. The greatest danger was sometimes the one hidden in the smallest wound. And beyond those hidden dangers in the land and work itself, there were risks that came walking toward them. Risks carried on two legs, wearing human faces, with outcomes no one could predict. Every approach to a new group began with uncertainty. The sight of people on the far horizon could carry promise or danger, and the next hour might hold shared food and talk, or silence edged with weapons. For the core of discovery, these meetings were not rare. They were part of the landscape itself. The ground they crossed belonged to nations with their own histories, trade routes, and relationships. How those meetings went could shape the expedition's progress and their chances of survival. Signs often appeared before the people themselves. A flicker of movement along a ridge, the faint sound of horses somewhere beyond, smoke rising into the sky from a place that had been empty hours before. With little time to prepare, the men arranged themselves to show readiness without provoking alarm. From that first moment, the meeting could open into welcome or close into a warning to turn back. Trade was a language of its own. Food could ease the first steps toward trust. Dried meat, berries, corn, shared across blankets or by hand. Horses, valued by all sides, could change the expedition's ability to move ahead. The exchanges, though, demanded care. Gift-giving followed patterns and meanings that could shift from one group to the next. Something offered in good faith might be misread if the wrong manner or moment was chosen. Communication carried its own risks. Words often passed through several languages before reaching their final meaning. A thought shared with one person might be relayed to another in a second tongue, then passed again in a third. At every stage, tone or intent could shift. A courteous request might arrive sounding like a demand. Misunderstandings were not just awkward. They could be dangerous when the subject was land, hunting rights, or passage. Even beyond words, the smallest acts could take on opposite meanings. How close you stood, whether you accepted food at the start or after an agreement, which hand you used, each could carry weight. In one place, stepping forward might reflect trust. In another, the same action could seem aggressive. For the Corps, recognizing these differences and adjusting quickly was as necessary as carrying their rifles or tools. The presence of a woman and infant within the party often signaled to many groups that they were not arriving for war. War parties rarely traveled that way. Such details stood alongside translated words to shape a first impression. Having someone who understood certain local customs could help the leaders frame their approach in ways less likely to draw suspicion. But nothing removed the underlying unpredictability of these meetings. Tension could grow without warning. A trade agreed in the morning might unravel before nightfall if either side felt wronged, or if old grievances surfaced. A quick movement toward a weapon, whether in readiness or habit, might still the air in a heartbeat. Leaders had to decide instantly whether to ease the moment, change the terms, or step back. None of the choices carried guarantees. Some encounters ended without building any trust at all. The claim that they traveled under U.S. authority meant little to those who had never ceded control of their lands. Talks could start openly and close in silence. Moving on from such places meant stepping forward without knowing what word might precede them. Still, there were meetings where understanding lasted. A good exchange, whether of goods, knowledge, or simple respect, might travel ahead of them by word of mouth. A fair price given, a promise kept, a question answered honestly could be remembered weeks later when they reached the lands of another group. Even small actions could strengthen the fragile network they needed to cross such distances. Relationships were not fixed. A group that offered food in a time of plenty might guard resources closely in a season of scarcity. Approaching each meeting as its own moment became essential. The past gave no certain protection, and grudges could fade or rise again with changing needs. Survival demanded flexibility. Refusing to bend might mean losing a chance at fresh horses before a mountain crossing, or missing a guide who knew which valley still held water. Giving too much, meanwhile, could invite higher demands the next time. Balancing between these risks required constant judgment, a work done in the mind as steady as the labor done with hands. It is easy to imagine explorers setting terms in every meeting, but in practice, these encounters relied heavily on adjustment. The goal was rarely to win outright, but to pass through, still able to move on. The measure of success was whether they left with their route open and their needs supplied. The reality was that this journey could not have happened without the people already living on the land. Guides could lead them along safe paths invisible to outsiders. Warnings could keep them from hostile ground or dangerous crossings. Food offered freely might sustain them past a point where their own stores ran thin. A place to shelter during a storm could mean the difference between life and loss. Even a brief exchange, directions to a ridge passable in winter, the location of a ford, could reduce weeks of uncertainty. Yet certainty was never permanent. A campfire could host both uneasy glances and genuine welcome before the same flames died. Trust had to be earned again and again. Friendship and fear could live side by side in the same place. The expedition learned to live with that duality, reading each face and gesture alongside the compass and map, knowing their path was made of agreements as much as of rivers and ridges. Those agreements could open the way forward, but the land ahead would offer no such chance for negotiation. Soon, the terrain itself would decide the limits of their strength. The first sight of the Rocky Mountains carried a weight unlike anything that came before. Long before the expedition reached their base, the stories had traveled ahead. Whispers of high passes that twisted into the clouds, of snow lying stubborn on the ground, even in summer. When those jagged peaks finally appeared, they stood distant yet already imposing, their upper slopes streaked white against an otherwise clear sky. For men used to the rolling swells of the plains, these were not gentle rises, they were walls. Every ridge promised another hidden behind it, every approach a climb that looked harder than the last. Awe might have touched them in that moment. The peaks cut the air cleanly, light and shadow carving them into ridges that seemed endless. But awe was no help when the ground started tilting. The closer they came, the steeper the valleys grew. Trails narrowed to barely more than animal tracks, winding along edges where loose stone could slip away under a boot. The wind changed too, sharper, colder, carrying a hint of what waited higher up. Climbing here demanded more than it ever had. On the open plains, you measured the day's work in miles. Here, even a few hundred steps could leave legs trembling. The air grew thin enough that breathing itself became a task. Lungs fought to fill, forcing all movement to slow. A warm morning could turn quickly, snow and mist dropping over the ridges with no warning. Vision shrank to the ground just ahead, following the footprints of the man in front, because the rest of the trail vanished into whiteness. Food became harder to find. Game was scarce in the high country, and what few animals lived there had little to eat themselves. Rivers were colder, their fish fewer and harder to catch. Provisions carried from lower ground disappeared faster under the heavier strain of each climb. Hunger dulled not only the body's strength, but the mind's willingness to keep forcing the next step. Faces thinned, shoulders stooped under loads that felt heavier each day. The ground itself turned against them. Rocks bit through the thin soles of boots. Steep slopes forced the body forward until it nearly tipped, calves burning with the effort of keeping balance. When snow covered the stones, every step risked twisting an ankle. Wet leather froze stiff at night, leaving boots brittle until the day's walking thawed them into cold, damp weight. Straps cut into shoulders and backs, and by the end of each ascent, hands sometimes shook too much to work the buckles cleanly. Above the tree line, fuel for fires all but disappeared. Nights came colder than most of them had known, with only small flames possible from what brush could be found. Blankets softened the bite, but never erased it, and sleep came in short, broken pieces. Wind scratched against rock and cloth, and always there was the deep, aching soreness that neither heat nor rest could cure fully before morning. The higher they climbed, the more the land seemed to close in. Valleys led to ridges. Ridges fell into steep drops. From below, a pass might look passable. From above, it could end as an unscalable wall. Turning back meant paying for every foot of the climb twice, once up, once down, along with the knowledge that days were being lost. Every lost day was also lost food, lost energy, and a widening gap between where they were and where they needed to be. The sound of the group changed here. Talking faded, replaced by the drag of boots across stone, the clatter of a slipped rock skittering downslope, and the short, fast breathing of men who could no longer afford to waste air on words. Out on easier ground, they might have covered the same stretch in a few hours. Here, they counted progress in careful steps and stops to steady themselves. Each climb was its own test, and none could be skipped. Even the strongest felt moments of weakness. A stumble that wouldn't have mattered on a flat trail could throw someone to their knees here. Sometimes, a pause was short enough to catch a breath. Other times, it was longer, the man staying low, shaking his head before willing himself up again. And there was never certainty that everyone would keep pace. Falling behind too far carried more risk than just arriving late to camp. It meant losing the path as darkness fell, or being caught in mountain weather alone. The Rockies stripped away assumptions about what they could endure. They made speed impossible and turned each day into a tally of how much could still be carried and how far the body could be forced to go. There was always another ridge beyond the one just crossed, another pass waiting after the one they'd fought to clear. Here, strength was more than muscle. It was the stubborn will to keep going when nothing in the land encouraged it. In these high passes, the question was no longer simply whether the expedition could reach its goal. It became a matter of who could keep moving. There were times when a man could not go on, and in this kind of country, the rest had to keep moving. The path ahead did not stop for anyone's weakness. Travel was already a fragile equation balanced on food, weather, daylight, and the strength of those still on their feet. Remove even one part for too long, and the whole venture could be thrown off balance. Out here, compassion carried weight, and some days, that weight could be more than the party could bear. There were moments when the party had to leave men behind or arrange for local shelter, knowing the choice was not born from indifference, but from survival's cold arithmetic. The land they crossed had few places where a faltering traveler could safely pause. Still, now and then, a small outpost or settlement appeared. Trappers' cabins, wintering posts, a handful of lodges tucked out of the wind. These became the rare places where an injured or exhausted man might stay while the rest pressed on. The decision was never made lightly, but the mountains and the miles allowed little room for sentiment if the mission was to continue. Weather, terrain, and the seasons kept any pause costly. A day spent slowing the pace too much could mean facing an early freeze or running short on food weeks later. And strength, once gone, could not easily be rebuilt in the conditions they faced. Hauling a man through narrow trails or across icy rivers could drain the energy of many at once, putting all of them at greater risk. Leaders measured these dangers quietly, thinking as much about tomorrow's obstacles as about the present moment. For the man being left behind, The change was immediate. The sound and presence of his companions were replaced by different voices, different routines, and by stillness. Gone was the clatter of camp breaking at dawn, the rhythm of feet on the trail, the sense of movement binding each day to the next. In its place was a waiting life, waiting for strength to return, for an opportunity to link up with another party, or simply for the season to shift in his favor. For those who moved on, the parting stayed in mind. It was a recorded truth between them that injury or sickness could happen to anyone. The image of a comrade watching the rest fade into the distance was not easy to shake. Each man knew that with a little misfortune, he could be the one standing still, while the others climbed out of sight. The reasoning remained plain. They couldn't risk the loss of the whole for the sake of one. Supplies and opportunity were too finely matched to their route. Their notes and journals might speak of arrangements made for a man's care, but they rarely capture the heaviness behind such decisions. Time on the frontier demanded that feelings yield to what conditions would allow. The cutting edge of these decisions was that there was seldom a second chance. The land didn't offer predictable paths back. A man left in safety might never see his companions again, no matter how solid the intentions at the moment of parting. There were too many variables between one winter and the next. Those decisions also shaped how the remaining men moved forward. Awareness of the cost hung in their thoughts, sharpening each choice. You kept your footing more carefully, paced your strength differently, guarded your health as best you could. Not out of fear alone, but because you had seen what happened when someone fell too far behind to recover. Kindness in this place looked different than it might elsewhere. It could mean sharing food for a final meal together before paths split. It could mean leaving whatever supplies could be spared without harming the group's own survival chances. Sometimes, it simply meant giving someone the best chance possible to meet another season alive, even if it meant seeing them fade into the distance while you kept walking. The quiet of such moments said more than any argument or promise could. Practical actions replaced ceremony, setting down a pack with supplies, giving a few last words of caution, nodding toward whatever shelter lay ahead. Then turning back to the trail, the sound of departing boots swallowing those final exchanges. Imagine watching the others' backs grow smaller. What would that feel like? The cold, the weight of the air, the awareness that from now on, each step you took would be without the company you had kept for so long. And for those still walking, knowing that every person they passed on the trail carried the same fragile claim to keep moving. In this way, progress was not just the sum of miles covered, but of decisions accepted. Some were made in the open, others in the quiet of a leader's mind, but all of them shaped who remained when the next challenge rose ahead. Some choices were remembered more vividly than others, often without names attached. Just a point along the map where one less shadow followed at dawn. They became part of the expedition's story as surely as any river crossed or peak climbed, and perhaps more telling in what they revealed about survival's terms. And it is from those terms that the final measure begins to take shape. Because what kept them moving was never a single bold act, but a steady endurance shaped by moments like these. Moments that asked for more than muscle. Moments that tested the will to keep going when mercy and necessity pulled in different directions. Survival in their world wasn't sealed by one defining moment. There was no single leap or spark of courage that decided everything. It was built from choices so small they could vanish into the rhythm of a day. Choices made again and again and again. The Lewis and Clark expedition didn't endure because of one great act, but because each man answered the quiet question of whether to rise, lift his load, and take the next step. They never faced a challenge with the promise of an audience or the neat close of a story. There was no music, no signal that the hardest part had just ended. Out there, survival was the unglamorous work of moving even when it felt like yesterday had already taken all you had. Every blister was carried forward, every cracked joint and dull ache folded into the miles. No hour was free from discomfort or hazard, and none of them waited to pass before the next arrived. The world they crossed set its own terms for time. Today, most of us assume outside help is reachable when things go wrong. That expectation changes how we react to hardship. In their winter and summer, the help you needed existed only among those walking beside you. Even then, giving help could mean risking the group's food, their time, or their safety. It wasn't that they ignored one another's trouble. It was that each burden added to the total weight all of them carried. What stretched ahead was measured not in days to rest, but in seasons to survive. An injury in early spring might still trouble a man through the autumn. A low supply of food in one fortnight could echo into months of hunger. And fatigue did not reset. It stacked and pressed downward until the body's starting point was lower than it had been the week before. In that press of time and distance, danger stopped feeling like an interruption. It became part of the background, as constant as sunrise and dark. A bout of stomach sickness after a hurried meal. A sudden wind shoving you toward the edge of a trail. The burst of cold water stealing breath before you could think. Each was another demand on strength already spent. They weren't born made for it. They carried no immunity to fear or hunger or exhaustion. They had strength from a life of physical work, yes, but what carried them further was the forging of endurance into habit. Doing the work became the natural response to the day's demands. It wasn't about feeling ready, it was about acting regardless. It's easy to think most of us would rise to such a trial, but in truth, our lives are arranged with escapes from hardship built in. Heat and cold are within our control. Food is chosen and varied. Hurt is followed by days of recovery without penalty. They didn't have those exits. The work was constant. There were no pauses because the weather was unforgiving. No reduction in what needed to be done when the body faltered. And that, the refusal to stop even under those conditions, was the real rarity. Admiration for such survival should carry its full weight. Their journey held no romance in the daily grind. The slow toll of illness, the quiet burials far from home, the possibility that a wrong word in negotiation might end the mission before the trail did. There was no shelter from any of it beyond what they built for themselves. Resilience was not the belief that things would get easier. It was breaking the journey down into what could be faced now. The next bend in the river, the next fire before night fell, the next day's measured rations, and closing out the rest. The Pacific was an idea too far away to shoulder whole. The mind stayed where the feet were. Modern endurance offers signals of progress, final turns, countable markers, the comfort of knowing what's left. They had no such signs. The turn ahead could lead to weeks more of climbing or walking through grassland without a single landmark. Progress had to be accepted without proof that the end was near. And yet they moved. Whether it was miles or mere yards, the direction mattered more than the size of the gain. It wasn't driven by heroics, but by something quieter, the repetition that erases the question of whether to go on and leaves only the motion itself. We measure our lives against calendars and clock hours. They measured theirs against what could be done before dark, or before the next storm, or before the food was gone. The means to continue came from among themselves. No supply drop or rescue team would appear over the horizon. To read their story as a line of victories misses the deeper truth. They lasted not because they struck down the land, but because they did not yield to it. That is survival in its clearest shape. Not a triumphant claim of conquest, but the steady choice to continue. When they walked back into the world they'd left, there was no single scene that could capture it all. What they brought home existed in maps, inked with rivers, and notes taken under wind and rain, in the memory of paths no one else had seen in years. The weight of the days, when each step felt near the last, is hidden between their lines. But it is there. That weight, the building up of small decisions until they form something enduring, is the final truth of survival. They finished not by a single act of glory, but by choosing, day after day, to take the next step. If this quiet endurance moved you, consider liking the video. It helps others find this story, and it leaves one question worth holding on to, a question that carries us forward into what comes next. They survived not by mastering the land, but by meeting its demands again and again. No single battle decided it, only the repeated choice to keep moving when it would have been easier to stop. Perhaps what they carried home most plainly was proof that endurance is often quiet. It leaves no roar of victory, only the steady record that they were still there at the end. If you appreciated this quieter look at endurance, consider subscribing for more slow, reflective history. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine stepping forward once more into a land that demands everything.